Well, good morning, brothers and sisters.
Good morning.
I got to tell you, I always enjoy the privilege getting to share the word with you and spend this time together. It's even better to get to see your smiling faces and know that we all have mouths underneath those masks. So I'm also really excited this morning. As I was walking around in the sanctuary and getting prepared to preach this message, Dale actually stopped me and asked how in the world I was going to preach on this scripture. So I'm interested to see how God moves in this text this morning. I've been praying through this text and thinking about our time together. And this morning we're going to be talking about responding to God's holiness. Now, God's holiness is really one of the least talked about topics in our churches. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it's one of the most misunderstood concepts in our faith. The interesting thing is, though, as little as we talk about it, and as little as we don't understand it, it's really one of the most prominent, important themes throughout the Bible. God's holiness is there from the beginning to the end. All the way from Genesis to Revelation. It's there. It's prevalent. It's who God is. And really the truth of the matter is God's holiness changes our lives. As we walk in relationship with the Lord who is holy, He calls us to be holy too. And He calls us to respond to His holiness. So this morning we're going to be talking about responding to God's holiness as we come together. And as many of you know, I was a teacher for a while, so we really have these two. The PowerPoint work. Cool. So we have these two essential questions that are going to guide our time together this morning. These two things that we're going to be talking about is, what does it mean that God is holy? And how should you and I respond to God's holiness? So first things first, we're going to define and talk about what does it literally mean that God is holy. So as we talk about and think about God's holiness, it normally helps when you're studying a new concept or a concept we don't understand to start with a little bit of a definition. That's where every learning journey begins, right? If you don't understand something, you want to know what the terms mean. You want to look into them. You might grab a dictionary. Most likely you'll probably pull out your phone and give it a quick Google. But we're going to figure out what it means that God is holy. I mean, we sing about God's holiness. We pray about God's holiness. And we've heard the term. We've heard it in conversation in the church. Maybe you've talked about other believers with other believers about this idea that God is holy. But what does it actually mean that God is holy? Again, it's this often misunderstood concept, and it's a concept we really don't spend a lot of time on. Really, to say that God is holy means that holiness is the fullness and completeness of all that God is. Now, that may still sound confusing, so I'm going to break it down a little bit for you. This is to say that God is whole. Just like the word holy, whole with a W-H-O-L-E. They sound very similar. God is whole. So what does it mean that God is whole? It means that He lacks nothing. There's nothing that God does not have and God is not. It means that He's unbroken. He's unchanged. He's undamaged. He's unfallen. He's without sin. So He, in and of Himself, is full and complete. Now we think about ourselves, when we think about the world that we're in, and it makes us uncomfortable, but the difference is that we are not full and complete. Because here's the difference and here's the catch. We have something in our lives called sin, right? It's the thing that drives us. It's the force in us since Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the garden that was forbidden. It's the force that drives us to do the very things that are against God's will and commands for our lives. It's the things that drive us to go in opposition of what God's created order and rule is for His world. God is without sin. He is holy and full and complete. We are with sin. We cannot be fully holy and complete. So what does it mean in our light of our sin that God is holy and complete? When we think about God's nature and His character, and we talk about things a lot like God's love, right? Everybody loves to talk about love. Everybody wants to be loved by God, right? Right? It's a good thing to want. And see, we love our spouses, for example. You can love your spouse, but God loves everyone with a full, unconditional love. We can love, but because of our sin, we can't love in fullness. Because God is complete and whole, His love is complete and whole. We forgive others. Someone might have wronged you. We've all been wronged. We've all been hurt. And we forgive others. But God in His holiness forgives and forgives and forgives and forgives in a more fuller way than we can. We can forgive, but God in His holiness forgives in a more full way. Same thing with anger. You and I get angry. Anybody ever been angry? If you're keeping your hand down, you're lying. You're not supposed to lie in church. We get angry. We get angry at injustice. We get angry when we feel that we've been wrong and we've been offended. God gets angry too, but in His anger, He doesn't lash out. He doesn't do wrong. A lot of times when we get angry, we resort to bad tactics like slinging mud, gossip, bitterness, spite. But God, because He's holy, all of His attributes and nature come together. See, this is the idea of holiness, that God's attributes and His nature all come together. He's perfectly loving, perfectly just, perfectly gracious, perfect in wrath. All of that God is comes together at one moment, all the time, in all eternity, for forever. That is what it means that God is holy. We in our sin can feel things like love. We can feel things like anger. We can even give forgiveness and give grace. But because of our sin, we have limitations. We are not in wholeness and fullness as our God is. To give you an illustration of this, I just saw this in practice yesterday. So as many of you know, we went on a bike ride, the teens and I, yesterday on the rail trail. And if you stepped outside for a little bit of time yesterday, you would know that it was a pretty hot day. It's about mid-80s. And as we were on this bike ride, the breeze was blowing and we're in the shade because we were on the rail trail. There was 3 teens and I that were riding along. And I knew that these teens, as we were heading out, were really skilled, great riders. I could see it in their eyes that they were ready. They had had like 10 cups of coffee or something before we even started out. And I knew that I was probably in trouble and out of my league. But I knew, as tired and as groggy as I was, that I was going to try my best to keep up. I told them, let's keep up, let's stay together. They smoked me. I'm not ashamed to admit and stand before you that they have more energy and spunk in them than I do. They raced ahead and they zipped ahead, and in my best efforts, in my best attempts, I couldn't keep up. No matter what I did, no matter how fast I pedaled, no matter how the sweat flooded the ground around us, I couldn't keep up in my own strength. See, this is how God's holiness is. We, in our best efforts and our best abilities, can never be holy like God in and of ourselves. God is ahead and beyond of what you and I can accomplish in our own strength, by our own merits, by our own abilities. Just like I couldn't keep up with the teens and be right there beside them, we cannot keep up with God's fullness, His wholeness, His holiness. So as we've responded, and as we've talked about defining God's holiness, we should turn our eyes into this concept of how do we respond to God's holiness? If God's holiness, as it is this real thing, and it's something we define and we talk about, how do we interact and engage with God's holiness? If we're in relationship with the true, holy, living God who is holy, how does that affect you and I? How do we interact with God's holiness, especially considering we ourselves are not holy? And that's where our text comes in this morning as we turn over to 1 Samuel, as Dale read for us. And I want to give you a little background before we dive into our text. If you grab a Bible and you flip to the table of contents, you'll notice something about 1 Samuel. That it's not the first book in the Bible, right? You're probably sitting there thinking, well, duh. The first book in the Bible is Genesis. And you're exactly right. So there's a whole lot of context and background building up to the book of 1 Samuel. To just dive into 1 Samuel wouldn't make sense. That's like opening the story at page 102 and starting to read it. You don't have any idea what's going on. So to catch you up to speed, we're thinking about the Bible. And even though it's 1 Samuel, it's a 2-part book, 1 and 2 Samuel. But it comes after a number of other Bible books. First is Genesis through Deuteronomy, right? We have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are the first 5 books of the Bible. God sets his people Israel apart. God creates the world. He creates Adam and Eve. They sin. They're kicked out of the garden. He floods the earth. Starts again with Noah and his family. Then he starts again with Abraham and a nation that is going to be born called Israel. And all through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, or Numbers and Deuteronomy, we see that God sets his people Israel apart. He calls his people to be his own, and he calls them to be his holy nation. He is holy. They are to respond as his holy people. And he gives them the law to do this. He gives them this law. That's the first, or the main part of the first 5 books of the Bible. It's like Leviticus, the part that if you read, you're like, I don't even have any idea what's going on. Those are God's law to his people. He's given them this law, his law to follow, to be his set-apart, holy people, different from all the other people in the world, specifically marked as his people. Now, as you can probably guess, and as you probably know, because of sin, time and time again, they break God's law and disobey God's law and are not able to keep God's law. No matter how hard they try in their own efforts, no matter how hard they try in their own strength and their own abilities and their own desire to really pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get it done, they still can't do it on their own. They break the law. They get it wrong. They sin and make mistakes. Sound familiar, right? You and I do the same thing. Just like Israel, in our own strength and all ability, no matter how hard we want to do the right thing, sometimes we just get it wrong. And we do the wrong thing. Now, we see this spiral continue as we go into the books of Joshua, Ruth, and Judges. In fact, by the time Samuel comes on the scene and 1 Samuel starts, we're told at the very end of the book of Judges, in Judges 21-25, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. See, it's this cycle building up to 1 Samuel, time and time and time again, that Israel sins. They get in trouble. Their enemies come against them, so they call out for God's help. Oh no, we've messed it up. We need you now, God. God helps them because he's gracious and good to his people. And they follow God for a little while. They play by his rules. Then they fall away again. It happens over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And again, it probably sounds familiar, right? It's close to home. There's seasons in our lives where we get ourselves into trouble. We create messes. And we cry out for God's help and deliverance. And we say, God, if you just do this, if you just help me this time, then I'll follow you. I'll give you this area of my life. And then for a while we stay on the track and then we fall away again. And we see as we enter the book of 1 Samuel that Israel isn't living holy. They aren't responding to God's holiness. They aren't necessarily keeping God's law. And they aren't acting as a holy nation. They're not living as the holy nation that God calls them to be. Yet in his grace, the story's not over yet. He's not done with them. Just like you and I, he gives second chances. He gives us third chances, 110 chances, and chances beyond and on and on, over and over again. So we enter into 1 Samuel and seeing that Israel's not doing so hot, responding to God's holiness. And we pick up for our text this morning. So we're going to dive in this and break it down together. So this is 1 Samuel 4, 1 through 2. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. So we've got two groups of people here. We got Israel, we got the Philistines. There's this battle going on. It's a battle scene, and how many of y'all have ever seen the movie Star Wars? Right? So we got good versus evil here. We got the good guys, Israel. They're like Luke Skywalker and the Jedi. They're supposed to be God's people. God's chosen people upon the face of the earth. They're supposed to be the good guys. And we got the Philistines you've probably heard of in the Bible. Goliath was one of the famous Philistines who David eventually kills. The Philistines are the bad guys, the enemies of God's people. They go against God's people, they harass God's people, and they cause trouble over and over and over again. They're this little stone in Israel's shoe that just keeps coming back over and over and over. And we see that this first battle that they go against the Philistines, Israel, God's people, and we see that they lose, interestingly enough, that they're defeated. And we ask ourselves this question, why does God allow the Philistines to win? If the Philistines are the enemies of God's people, and God is sovereign over all the world, and He's in control all the time, right? Why did God allow the Philistines to win? And we're going to come back to that question. I want you to keep that in your mind, because Israel's asking this question too. They're like, what? We're your people, God. Why did you let them win? So we continue on to verse 3 through 5. And it says, when the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that He may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. So we see Israel's asking this question that we're asking. Why did God allow the Philistines to win? What's going on? And we see that the elders of Israel get together. They have this little think tank moment. Next thing you know, they get a light bulb idea, like the old cartoons where, boom, the light bulb lights up above their head. They get this idea of, all right, why did God let us lose? They're like, you know what? Let's take the ark with us this next time around. Let's go back out, go back to it, and we'll take the ark. We'll take the ark of the Lord. Now the ark, if you follow along in the Bible, is the representation of God's presence, His present dwelling among and with His people. The ark is not God Himself, obviously, because God is not in an image, but it's His representation of Him going and dwelling with His people. So they get this idea and they say, you know what? We're going to have God in it with us this time. We're going to take the representation of His presence and it's going to go along for the ride. And the people love it. They're shouting. There's this rejoicing. There's so much shouting, as a matter of fact, it says it raised with such a great shout that the ground shook. So there's this big parade, all this excitement. Yeah, the elders of Israel really got a good idea this time around. But what's the problem here? There's a little bit of a catch and a tension, because the reality is, if they were so worried about having God with them, why didn't they have the ark there in the first place? Was Israel actually willing to follow and obey God? Or did they just like to have Him around to win their battles that they couldn't handle on their own? Was it just a matter of, well, I'll see what I can do first, and if I can't handle it, then maybe you can tag along for this ride, God? And we think about this concept, and we see that with Israel, God is a bit of an afterthought. And that's not how it should be. God is not an afterthought. You don't just put Him on the shelf like a Christmas toy that you don't want anymore. You've all seen it. Maybe you remember it from your childhood. Maybe you've seen it with your kids or grandkids. They get something really exciting Christmas morning that they've been asking for. They play with it for like a day, maybe 2 days, maybe a week. And then it gets stored away in the closet and put again till some other distant time. And that's not how our God is, brothers and sisters. He doesn't just go on the shelf in a memory box for us to go and get Him when it's convenient for us, when we need His help, when we come to the conclusion that we can't do it on our own. So the fact of the matter is, God is holy. He is sovereign. Really, he's the one in control at all times, and we play by his rules. He doesn't play by our rules or our timetable. And as we're going along with Israel here, I have this question for you. Is God where you run to first? Is he your first go-to response? Or do you only run to God in crisis? Do you only run to God when you've tried to do it and came to the conclusion, well, maybe this one's a little big for me, so maybe I need some higher power swinging at the pitch? Or are you willing to surrender and say, you know what, God, the big, the small, even if I think I can handle it on my own, I trust your plan in your hands better than my own? Is God where you run to first? Or are you like Israel that once your tail's between your legs and you feel defeated, then is when you run to God? And we're going to continue along here and see how are the Philistines going to respond to this. So we got our two sides. We got the Israelites, we got the Philistines. And now the Philistines are catching wind of this, the neighbors across the battle line. And we pick up in verses 6 through 9. Here in the uproar, the Philistines asked, what is all this shouting in the Hebrew camp? When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hands of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. What do you notice about the Philistines here? What do you observe? Because something sticks out to me when I read this, that it appears that the Philistines actually remember and acknowledge God's power even before the Israelites do. See, the Philistines remember God's work and mighty hand against the Egyptians back in the Exodus, when God sent the plagues and freed his people from Pharaoh and Egyptian slavery. It should have been the Israelites that remember that, but that's the Philistines. It's the Philistines saying, hey, these are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. The Philistines are remembering God's faithfulness and his power, when really that should have been what Israel was doing. And you would have thought if Israel would have remembered Egypt, if they would have remembered God in their story with them and for them throughout their history, if they would have remembered the Exodus and God's faithfulness time and time again when they were faithless, that they would have turned to God first. That he would have been their first response. They wouldn't have tried to go at it in their own strength with their own abilities. And we're continuing along with this Philistine response. What are the Philistines going to do? They're going to do what they said they were going to do. They're going to fight. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated. And every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. What happened here? Shouldn't Israel have gotten it right this time and won? I mean, they got the ark of the Lord. They tried to do it the right way this time. Yet we see that God's people are in defeat. The ark, as a matter of fact, is captured. The enemies of God's people have won this battle. And we return back to this question, why did God allow the Philistines to win? This has happened twice now, in the same passage. Why did God allow the Philistines to win? Did God fail? Was he asleep? Was he out to lunch? I mean, hello, God. The Israelites are your holy people. They're the people that you called and set apart. His holy nation, right? Except the key is that they weren't acting like it. The key is that their heart wasn't in it for the Lord. See, how is God going to get your attention. Has it ever occurred to you, brothers and sisters, that God will let you get to the end of your rope, the end of yourself, so that you will actually finally listen to Him? That you'll finally surrender, that you'll finally trust in and obey Him? That maybe it takes a little bit of defeat for us to get over ourselves, get over our own pride and our own selfish ambition, and finally get in line with the Lord's program? C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian writer who wrote many faith-specific works, including the Chronicles of Narnia, he had a quote that says, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciousness, but shouts in our pain. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." See, maybe, just maybe, we need a wake-up call. Maybe we face and taste defeat because we tried to do it in our own strength, in our own way, when really we need to come to terms with His way. From the ashes and from the dust of what seems over and done, from what seems like the end of the line and defeat, and that's actually really the beginning of the path of where we begin to see that we can take our hands off the wheel. It's not up to us. Even in our own abilities, we can't do it and control it all. We surrender ourselves, and that's when we know that only He can achieve victory, that He is the Lord of our lives. It's not about us and what we can do and what we can pull off on our own. And God allows us to come face to face with this reality to get our attention and to see when we're out of step with Him. So we return back to this question: how should you and I respond to God's holiness? What can we learn from Israel's repeated failure and foolishness time and time again as we see them throughout the Old Testament and even throughout our passage this morning? How do we respond to God's holiness? And I have this picture for us as we close out. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. How many of y'all have ever been on a road trip? Most of you have. Some of you might be planning one this summer. And I want you to be honest, how many of you ever had or been a backseat driver? Or maybe a side seat driver, right? Backseat, side seat, same thing. See, we've all been there, whether we like to admit it or not, whether we gasp, whether we grab the panic bar, whether we just try and close our eyes and take a nap and pray until it's over. But see, why I'm showing you this picture and using this to close out is that God doesn't need you to be His backseat driver. God has the wheel, and it's not negotiable that you get to drive every now and again. God doesn't get tired, and He doesn't need you to take over for a little while. That's not what God does. God is holy, so He's never going to get it wrong. He's never going to fail. God is holy, so He will always do what is right, what is best, what is good. Just because it's good doesn't always mean that it feels good, but He is good, and that's the key. Brothers and sisters, God is holy, so we can trust Him. Because He's without sin, because He will never break His promises to us. God is holy. He is whole. He is complete. You can take your hands off the wheel. You can surrender the steering wheel of your life. I've got some truth for you that it was never really in your hands anyway, no matter how hard you thought it was. You don't have to white knuckle it or worry. You don't need to give Him directions or tell Him He may have made a wrong turn or He needs to slow down. You can surrender your heart and your life to Him, brothers and sisters. Trust completely the one who is holy. Trust completely the one who is complete. Amen.